Good day, everyone. My name is Latonya Clayton, an MSc Development Studies student, and today I will be presenting on my study, Resist or Reform, Corporal Punishment, Legislation, and Disciplinary Practices in Jamaican Primary Schools. This presentation consists of an introduction to the topic, a review of current and relevant literature, the research questions, methodology, and the methods used, an analysis and presentation of the preliminary findings, the interpretation of these findings and the implications, as well as preliminary recommendations, limitations of the study, and the conclusion. So, despite growing calls to end corporal punishment in schools, the practice is still widespread in Jamaica, indicating a disconnect between policy and practice, and that the effects of the legislation are not being fully felt. This raises a question. Why is it that the legislation fails to influence the daily practices in schools? This research explores how legal reforms interact with cultural, historical, and social factors that perpetuate corporal punishment. The issue is directly tied to development goals such as SDG 3, Good Health and Well-being, SDG 4, Quality Education, and SDG 16.2, which is the elimination of violence against children. Jamaica has also committed to protecting children through national strategies like Vision 2030 and international frameworks such as the Conventions on the Rights of the Child, yet the enforcement of these commitments remain inconsistent. Very few studies actually critically examine the interaction between legal framework and the subsequent effects on disciplinary practices in Jamaica, hence the need for a study of this nature. Let's begin with a review of the literature. Note that all the studies reviewed were qualitative in nature, which influenced the research design of this study. The first major theme is the effects of legislation on corporal punishment globally and regionally, which helps to frame the context within Jamaica. Elgar et al. 2018, in his study on corporal punishment bans in 88 countries, found that partial bans on corporal punishment send mixed messages and are often ineffective. This finding is useful in the Jamaican context as we currently have a partial ban that applies to schools and not homes. Regionally, a pattern can be seen with the use of corporal punishment as Fielding and Balance in 2020 conducted a study in the Bahamas, and London et al. 2023 conducted a study in Grenada which showed that historical acceptance of corporal punishment rooted in colonialism makes reform difficult. The same colonial history and social norms persist in Jamaica. Fielding and Balance also revealed that public discourse was crucial for both enabling and preventing the continuation of the practice, which influences the design of this study and its analysis of public discourse in Jamaica. Landon et al. Further explains that the commitment to traditional practices resulted in teachers still resorting to corporal punishment even after learning alternate methods, as they believe physical punishment is more likely to result in obedience. Linking with the second theme, cultural and historical factors influencing resistance to disciplinary reform, Morris Francis 2024 also supports the view that corporal punishment originated during colonialism as a method of exerting control through discipline to reinforce hierarchical authority in Caribbean schools. Burke and Sutherland in 2014 and Smith in 2016 connect Jamaica's use of corporal punishment to British colonial practices and slavery, stating that boys in particular are disciplined more harshly, which mirrors the colonial legacy. Now, this theme further relates to the next theme of socialization, as the continuation of this practice is accredited to socialization because the use of physical discipline in child rearing has been passed down through generations. Fielding and Balance also reveal that in the Bahamian context, older, less educated, and more religious individuals were more likely to support and enforce the use of corporal punishment because they believe it contributed to their success and the success of their children. Smith, 2016, as well as Fielding and Balance, also underscored the link between the use of corporal punishment over generations and the broader culture of violence which occurs due to a desensitization to the use of physical punishment. Despite this, Burke and Sutherland found in 2014 that 30% of respondents had advocated for ending corporal punishment, which contradicted previous findings regarding socialization. This could help to account for why positive alternatives like the IRA toolbox, which use timeouts, behavior contracts, positive reinforcement, and positive behavior interventions support (PBIS) programs, found some amount of success, according to Baker Henningham in 2019. However, uptake remains limited due to cultural resistance and weak enforcement. Theoretically, Bandura's social learning theory, Pavlov's and Skinner's classical and operant conditioning models all explain how the use of physical punishment reinforces a fear-based type of authority and are therefore normalized and passed down. Moreover, Beccaria's theory of punishment and deviance explains how physical punishment is seen as the best deterrence for unwanted behavior. As such, nevertheless, there have been several gaps found in the literature as very few studies, especially post COVID-19, look at the actual implementation of legislation within the Jamaican context and how cultural factors can shape public responses, which is a gap this study aims to bridge. Now, let's look at the methodology used. The main research question to be answered is what cultural factors influence the effective implementation of legislative reform on corporal punishment in Jamaican primary schools. To facilitate answering that question, there are four sub-questions which look at how legislative reforms influenced school disciplinary practices, what cultural and historical factors shape resistance, what is the public's perception of this enforcement, and what alternatives are being used or are needed to replace corporal punishment. For this study, I used a qualitative interpretivist multi-method approach using documentary analysis and content analysis of only secondary data to conduct thematic coding. Though there is a lack of primary data, this method was best suited to ethically explore socially sensitive issues while identifying themes and socially constructed meanings through public discourse. To be a bit more specific, documentary analysis was done on studies from Morris Francis and Smith, as well as reports from UNICEF, CAPRI, which is the Caribbean Policy Research Institute, and the Ministry of Education, in order to systematically examine and interpret these documents to gain insights into the topic at hand. They also help to provide relevant contextual data for the research questions, and they were credible sources for triangulation. Now, content analysis was done of TVJ News broadcast, All Angles broadcast, the JIS, the Jamaica Gleaner, Jamaicans for Justice radio broadcast, and that was done to analyze the content of qualitative data, in this case text and audio, to identify patterns and themes, to capture the public discourse through the media outlets, to reveal societal attitudes, etc. And transcripts were obtained for the videos in order to use the NVivo software to do the identification of themes. The sampling was purposive with inclusion and exclusion criteria for sources selected, such as a timeline relating to keywords like corporal punishment and school discipline, and sources were from credible websites and within the Jamaican context. Ethical considerations included using anonymity, using secondary research due to sensitivity, adding a critical reflexivity statement, and using the guidance of the research supervisor to ensure fairness. And now for the findings. The study employed thematic content analysis to examine different perspectives and discover approximately 13 themes relating to the different research questions. Note that linked themes are highlighted in the same color. Now, the first finding regarding research question 1 is that Jamaica's legal framework as it pertains to corporal punishment is fragmented, hence the theme of dysfunction in legislation or legal enforcement concerns and gray areas. The Education Act and other relevant policies have not been fully amended, and as such, some policy guidelines allow teachers to determine what punishment is reasonable or fair. Moreover, corporal punishment remains legal in homes. This creates a gray area where both teachers and parents are unsure about what is legal. The UNICEF in their country report on Jamaica highlighted that while Jamaica has adopted the global child rights necessary, there is a disconnect which results from what Capri and Morris Francis both highlighted as inconsistent policy efforts. So this legal ambiguity undermines enforcement and breeds public mistrust in the government's ability to implement reform. Hence why there's a perceived disconnect between international commitments, policy, and domestic practices. Now, regarding question 2, the second major finding is that there is cultural resistance. Corporal punishment is deeply rooted in religious and colonial ideologies. Many Jamaicans cite biblical verses such as spare the rod, spoil the child to justify the practice. While most of the themes mentioned were in the literature review, such as the historical impact and traditional child rearing norms and the generational transmission of corporal punishment norms, it was found in the study that religious justifications have led to many of the cultural norms and values upheld by Jamaicans, as the country is heavily rooted in Christianity or in religion. Now, religious justification refers to the act of believing corporal punishment, in this case, to be reasonable due to it being divinely sanctioned. It was found through the documentary analysis of the reports and the content analysis of media videos that many parents, teachers, and general members of the public saw corporal punishment as a method of discipline approved by God. Teachers and parents often refer to their own upbringing as evidence that corporal punishment is necessary for obedience and respect. These beliefs are passed down generationally and are difficult to shift as people are resistant to change. This has created tension between religious and cultural freedom and children's and child rights legislation, ultimately affecting the influence of the legislation. As it relates to research question number 3, it was found that public opinion is divided, or as the theme states, there is mixed public opinions on the ban. Some support the ban for child protection, but others see it as an attack on teachers' authority and their traditions. Many are also confused about what constitutes discipline versus abuse. Based on the CRC, different forms of physical punishment used would constitute abuse. However, many did not see the use of corporal punishment as abuse, but simply as a necessary part of discipline needed to curb the rising indiscipline of students, or needed as a form of deterrence against students participating in unwanted behaviors. This confusion was also worsened by inconsistent messaging and poor communication from authorities. Now, regarding the alternatives, the reports, as well as media broadcasts, indicated that alternatives like timeouts, reducing playtime, behavior contracts, and creative methods such as art or journaling have been piloted and have shown some amount of success. In fact, programs like the IRI Toolbox and PBIS have shown positive results with a reduction in the number of students punished over a period of a month. That's the period that the study was conducted at the primary school for back in 2019. However, these are not yet widespread, and teachers often revert to corporal punishment when they feel the alternatives are ineffective or unfamiliar. This indicates a need for training sessions to further educate more teachers about these alternatives and create consistent school policies, hence the theme of need for public education and training. So now let's interpret these findings based on the research questions. In summary, legal reform without cultural engagement is insufficient. Regarding the first research question on the influence of legislative reform on disciplinary practices, despite incremental legal reforms, Jamaica has yet to complete a full prohibition of corporal punishment with consistent implementation. Fragmentation in the laws and policies have created gray areas which increase the confusion amongst public opinion due to the lack of clarity and allow people to continue using physical discipline. The implication of that is that since the law has not yet been fully operationalized, the impacts of the legislative effort have been limited. Moreover, without fully established and enforceable policies, it is difficult to standardize penalties for non-compliance unless teachers are reported to local authorities. The preliminary recommendation would therefore be to accelerate efforts to amend the Education Act and the Child Care and Protection Act to explicitly prohibit corporal punishment in all settings, not simply to issue directives afterwards. Moreover, support with this Moreover, this needs to be supported with, strong enforcement mechanisms, such as penalties for those who do not abide by the policies. Regarding research question 2, which looks at the cultural factors that influence implementation, the study confirmed that cultural beliefs continue to outweigh policy. Traditional child-rearing practices, which are rooted in religious beliefs, colonial legacies, and generational norms, significantly shaped a resistance to the implementation of legislative efforts on corporal punishment. The belief that physical punishment is necessary to instill obedience and moral discipline persists and has been supported by biblical references. The implication of this is that these deep-rooted cultural beliefs have created a normative environment where reform is now seen as a threat to cultural identity, tradition, and authority given to teachers. Beliefs about the necessity of physical punishment for deterrence have led to a fear among parents and teachers about a potential rising in indiscipline should the use of corporal punishment be eliminated completely. Unless this fear is eradicated through aligning government policies and with traditional beliefs, it will be difficult for the impact of legislative reforms to be felt, even if the policies are properly implemented. Therefore, the recommendation would be to develop culturally sensitive public education programs and campaigns that engage religious leaders and other forms of traditional authority to help reframe traditional beliefs around discipline and align them with non-violent practices. For research question 3, public perception is heavily influenced by the lack of clarity in the legislation and traditional beliefs. While some saw the law as necessary, they believed it was poorly enforced, and others had a genuine distrust for the government and believed that they were trying to criminalize informal forms of punishment. As mentioned earlier, teachers also fear that there would be a rise in discipline without the without the impending threat of physical punishment that deters bad behavior. The implication of this is that public confidence in the education and legal system continues to weaken due to the lack of transparency surrounding practices. However, the divide in the opinion presents a contradiction which shows that there is a possibility of people veering away from traditional beliefs. Without the proper systems in place to facilitate the other forms of disciplines, it would be difficult for those who oppose to change the status quo. Therefore, a preliminary recommendation would be, once developed, to disseminate clear and accessible guidelines on disciplinary laws applicable to the primary school system, as well as to extend training sessions to parents as well, just to ensure that all stakeholders are aware of the standards being upheld. Finally, alternatives have been introduced through pilot programs and teacher training. However, they are not as widespread and therefore not fully understood by the majority. The implication of this is that it is possible for non-violent programs to be adopted and to produce successful results, which could combat the fear of indiscipline increasing when physical punishment decreases. However, for programs to be successful, there needs to be institutional support and efforts must be made concurrently to tackle the cultural beliefs and attitudes that can impact implementation efforts. Additionally, the preliminary recommendation would be to increase training and resource allocation for positive disciplinary programs in order to employ these pilot programs island-wide, as well as to incorporate it into teacher education and national curriculums. The main limitation of this study was the fact that it was limited to secondary data, which may lack recent or first-hand insights. As such, I would recommend that for future research, there should be confidential interviews with teachers and students. Other limitations included the use of purposive sampling, which could have led to selection bias, the researcher's positionality, a lack of relevant studies done in the post-COVID environment, the time constraints of the study, which could have limited the representativeness of the data, and the fact that ongoing reforms can lead to inconsistency in public opinion. To mitigate against these, Triangulation of data from several media sources as well as several different reports helped to provide more representative data. The presence of the research supervisor also helped with reducing the selection bias in sampling, and the reflexivity statement helped to address the positionality. Along with the preliminary recommendations already mentioned, such as the public education campaigns, I would recommend a monitoring and evaluation system for any disciplinary program implemented, as well as future research such as comparative studies across the Caribbean and a gender based analysis of corporal punishment impacts. In conclusion, cultural norms, legal ambiguity, and inconsistent enforcement continues to undermine legislative reforms on corporal punishment. The overall development implication is that without stronger laws, cultural engagement, and support systems, corporal punishment will continue to be a normalized practice which has long-term consequences for children's health and societal safety. Thank you for your time. I welcome any feedback you may have.